Alan Brown, please.
Thanks, Chair. Can I just ask Mr. Springford first? You mentioned there about Labour Party were saying some things that were possible and some things that are not possible. So what kind of comments have they made that's just not going to be possible to get agreement on?
Well, possible and impossible is probably too binary. But I mean, one of the things that I think has been characterising the debate about the renegotiation of the TCA is a general sense that, if something is win-win from a trade perspective, theory of comparative advantage and, well, it would be great if we could have your imports because they'll be cheaper and you take ours because they'll be better quality. That is not necessarily how it's going to go. Most trade negotiations are about trading off competing producer interests, not consumer interests. And so, thinking about the arrangement as a whole for the EU, the TCA provides for zero tariffs in goods. They have a comparative advantage in goods which is stronger than ours. It's less comprehensive in services, which is our comparative advantage. And because it's a larger market, then it can bear the cost of any trade barriers between the UK and the EU better than the UK can. So, there's going to have to be something which is quite significant for the UK to give up in order for there to be some big changes. And I think even, things like the proposal by Labour that, okay, well, let's go for a sanitary and phytosanitary agreement. Is the UK willing to shadow EU laws is one question, but on the EU side, this will mean more competition for French farmers. And, they're in a perhaps stronger position in terms of their exports to the rest of the EU right now. So, maybe they're not going to be super happy about it. And that's the same with mutual recognition of qualifications. Having UK accountants, lawyers and consultants enter the EU and be able to do more work there might challenge German or Nordic companies. So we have to bear in mind that this is as much about producer interests as consumer interests, and so it may well be possible that Labour's asks are renegotiated, but it's not going to be something where it's like, oh yes, well that's obviously win-win for both sides from a consumer or an economist perspective.
Okay, and maybe similar to that then, in terms of trade-offs, is there any potential significance of the fact that the TCA provisions in fisheries and energy are due to expire in 2026, which is obviously the same time as the 5-year review falls? On fisheries, as David said, there's a provision for either annual or multi-annual agreements about catch and quotas and access to each other's waters and so forth. I don't know how that will go. We didn't get a great deal under the TCA. The UK's access to more of the EU's pre-existing quota is being phased in over those 5.5 years, and it's an increase in 25% overall. It could be possible for the UK in that negotiation to take a kind of maximalist, we're going to reserve our waters for UK fishers. The question then is how that feeds into some of the other negotiating positions in other chapters. And it was deliberate, I think, by the EU to make the renegotiation on fish happen at the same time as the review of the implementation, because they like to have a broad range of different files to be able to negotiate between and to trade off between one another. And then on energy, we have the North Sea cooperation on building new wind farms and interconnectors between North Sea, largely between countries that are bordering the North Sea. That, I think, will continue because it's a shared resource. In terms of reducing some of the costs of electricity trading that have been imposed by the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, in order to be able to have access, for example, to instantaneous pricing, which allows energy trade to be done basically on an instantaneous basis, then there are questions about whether the UK would be willing to sign up and dynamically align with some of the rules of the single electricity market and potentially submit to European Court of Justice oversight. So it's possible.
So on that, Synergy UK have estimated that the current electricity trading arrangements adding £1 billion a year to our energy bills. So is that the trade-off the UK government's going to have to do to get rid of these overheads?
Yes, I think that's right. So that's the estimate. I haven't looked into how accurate that is. Potentially plausible. I mean, one of the things that is going to happen is that electricity trading with the North Sea as a resource is going to become more important as a way to balance supply and demand between the UK and other European countries. And the more that the UK can reduce the cost of those trading, the cheaper electricity will be. But I can't say exactly how much. The current estimate is about 1 billion.
Okay. Can I ask Catherine McBride? So earlier on, if I paraphrase, you said big companies like Rolls-Royce, the additional overheads is relatively small. They can carry the overheads, but there's barriers for small and medium-sized companies trading with the EU. And I was looking at the UK government's own statistics on this, and they say that 99.9% of the business population works or is employed in small and medium-sized enterprises. So by your words, we're saying 99.9% of the business population now have trade barriers in terms of the line of work to the EU?
No, not even vaguely. Only about 10% of UK companies and businesses trade anywhere at all. And that was a statistic that Liam Fox mentioned when he was first made the Trade DIT Minister. I think it was in 2017, and it hasn't changed. In fact, it's gone down slightly. So most companies are small companies.
If it's went down, that's less trade then?
I mean, we have a very big domestic market. Though a lot of people like to talk about trade intensity, that isn't really a big problem for the UK. We are basically a domestic market, and our trade is quite a small part of what we do. This is very different from, say, Germany, which has a higher trade in proportion to its GDP. But countries like America and Japan, their trade intensity is only 25%. So that there's, for people to get worried about trade intensity, they're missing the point. The UK is basically a domestic market. We have some very, very big multinationals that trade out of the UK.
The domestic market, we don't have to worry about exports. We just protectionist.
One of the reasons people like to sell things to the UK is we have a very wealthy consumer base here. We have a very affluent population if you compare it to world populations. Therefore, that's why the German car manufacturers they like selling things to us rather than buying things from us. So it's, if you run a successful business in the UK and you're selling things to the UK, you're doing okay generally. You don't have to export. It'd be nice if more companies did. I'm not anti-export, but I'm just saying that, yes, you're right. The economy itself relies on small and medium-sized enterprises. They employ most people. But when it comes to our trade figures, our trade is the exact opposite. Most of our trade is done by large multinationals.
I'll need to move on. And just very quickly to yourself, Mr. Henig, if that's okay. How far is the possible scope of changes to TCA constrained by the EU's red lines? Effectively, whether the UK can cherry pick particular aspects of the single market rather than the whole package?
Well, obviously, any negotiation is constrained by the red lines, and we'll have our own red lines. But there's a lot that can be done. So I was working with a crossbench group of MPs and businesses in the UK Trade and Business Commission. We came up with over 100 recommendations, many of which were with the EU, of things that can practically be done that are not cherry picking. Now, I fear John Springford may say that many of them economically wouldn't make a huge difference, but for individual businesses, there are things that can be done for businesses in all of your constituents which will make a difference to, at least to them, if not fundamentally necessarily to the big picture of UK exports. So there are many things that are worth doing in this trade relationship that we can do, short of of challenging those red lines or fundamentally changing our relationship with the EU.
Thank you very much. Mark.